I had lived in that apartment building for nearly a year before I truly noticed her. Noticed, in the way you notice someone beyond polite waves or nods in the hallway. She was simply there, a quiet presence, the kind you register but don't linger on. Until one rainy evening changed that. I had just come back from a long shift, my clothes damp with the mist that clung to the air. The hallway smelled faintly of wet concrete and the detergent from the communal laundry room. That's when I saw her, my neighbor, carrying 2 heavy grocery bags, trying to manage her keys at the same time. She wasn't struggling exactly, but there was a kind of quiet frustration in the way she exhaled, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. She was older than me, maybe by 15, even 20 years. I'd always guessed somewhere in her 40s. But that night, she didn't look distant or untouchable, she looked human. I offered a quick smile, unsure if I should step in. "Need a hand?" She glanced up, startled for a moment, then softened. Her eyes, dark, steady, but carrying something guarded, met mine. "No, it's fine. I've got it." Her voice was calm, controlled, like someone who'd learned not to lean on others too easily. Still, she allowed me to hold the door open while she shuffled through, balancing the bags with surprising grace. The motion was simple, but I caught the faint scent of her perfume as she passed, subtle, not loud, like vanilla softened by rain. "You live just down the hall, right?" she asked, almost as an afterthought. "Yeah," I said. "Next to the stairwell." She nodded, half smiling, and for a moment, I thought that was the end of it. But something lingered in her expression. Noticing, perhaps, that I was younger. Or maybe measuring whether I was harmless. I didn't blame her. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but charged with a quiet awareness. I became suddenly conscious of how ordinary I must have seemed, 24, still figuring out my life, standing there in damp sneakers while she carried herself with the ease of someone who had lived through more than I could guess. She shifted the bag on her hip and murmured, "Well, thanks for the door." I nodded. "Any time." She gave me a small smile then, brief, but real. And something about it hit me harder than it should have. It wasn't flirtatious, wasn't even meant to linger. Yet it did. Because behind that composed exterior, I thought I saw something else, a flicker of weariness, maybe even loneliness. When she finally disappeared into her apartment, the sound of her lock clicking into place, I stood there longer than I meant to. The hallway felt strangely empty without her presence. It wasn't love at first sight. Not even attraction, not in the way people talk about. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that sneaks up on you, whispering that someone you barely know might matter more than you expect. And from that night on, whenever I heard her footsteps in the hall or the faint sound of her door unlocking, I found myself listening a little too closely, waiting for that next small encounter. Because for reasons I couldn't explain, my neighbor, the woman who seemed so steady, so self-contained, had suddenly unsettled something in me. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The next few weeks brought more of those small moments. Nothing dramatic. Just chances. Passing each other on the stairs. A polite nod in the hallway. The quiet recognition of 2 people sharing the same building but living very different lives. It was on a Saturday morning when the first real conversation happened. I had stepped outside onto the front porch of the building with a mug of coffee in hand, trying to shake off the fog of a restless night. The air was cool, filled with the sound of birds that hadn't yet been drowned out by traffic. And there she was, already seated on the steps, a book in her lap, her own mug resting beside her. I hesitated. I didn't want to intrude. But she glanced up, saw me standing there, and with the faintest tilt of her head, motioned to the step beside her. "You're up early," I said, lowering myself onto the cool concrete. She gave a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I'm always up early. Habit. My body doesn't really allow me to sleep in anymore." She closed the book gently, placing it across her knees. "You couldn't sleep," I admitted. "Coffee's my survival plan." That earned me another smile, small, but warmer than the last. And just like that, the silence between us shifted. We talked about nothing at first. The weather. The neighborhood. She told me she liked the mornings because they belonged to her, quiet, undemanding, free of expectations. I found myself listening more than talking, not because I had nothing to say, but because I liked the sound of her voice. Calm. Low. Almost careful. At some point, she asked, "What do you do?" The question shouldn't have mattered, but the way she asked it, genuine, curious, made me feel as though my answer might reveal more about me than I was ready for. "I'm figuring that out," I said truthfully. "Graduated last year, trying a few things. Nothing's settled yet." She studied me for a moment, not with judgment, but with that kind of thoughtful look people wear when they're remembering their own younger selves. "That's not a bad place to be. Scary, maybe. But not bad." I asked about her work, and she told me she used to manage events but had stepped back after her divorce. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Still, there was something in the way she said it, like the word divorce was just the surface of a story far deeper. Our mugs emptied, the morning grew brighter, and the conversation meandered, into favorite books, into places she used to travel, into why I loved the smell of rain. It wasn't a flirtation, not then. But there was something steady building between us. Something in the pauses, and the way her eyes lingered a little longer each time I spoke. At one point, when I passed her my mug so she could smell the new roast I'd bought, our fingers brushed. Just a fleeting touch, skin against skin. But it sent a jolt through me I wasn't prepared for. She must have felt it too, because her hand lingered an extra fraction of a second before she pulled away, her lips pressing into a line that might have been a smile she wasn't ready to show. When we finally stood to go back inside, the day already shifting into its usual rhythm, she looked at me and said, "You're easy to talk to." It was a simple statement, but the weight of it stayed with me long after the door closed behind her. Because easy wasn't the word I would have chosen. Magnetic was closer. She pulled me into her orbit without even trying. And whether she knew it or not, I was already circling closer. It was late one evening when I saw her again. The hallway lights flickered overhead as I returned from a run, my sweatshirt damp, headphones slung around my neck. Her door was slightly ajar, and I caught the sound of soft music drifting out, low, a little melancholy. I hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but before I could move past, the door opened wider. She stepped out, startled at first, then easing into a small smile when she recognized me. "You're always moving," she said lightly, eyeing the sweat on my clothes. "Trying to tire myself out," I replied. "Otherwise I'd just end up staring at the ceiling all night." Her smile softened, but there was something behind it, a flicker of weariness. She held the door open a little longer than necessary, then asked, almost casually, "Do you want to sit for a while? I made tea." I don't know if she regretted the invitation the second it left her lips, but I nodded before she could take it back. Inside, her apartment was warm, dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner. It smelled faintly of lavender and something deeper, like cedarwood. A space that felt lived in but carefully kept, as though she was trying to hold chaos at bay. We sat on her couch, mugs of chamomile tea warming our hands. For a while, the conversation stayed light. Work, the weather, the stray cat that sometimes wandered near the building. But then, almost without warning, her tone shifted. "I don't usually talk like this," she began, her fingers circling the rim of her mug. "But sometimes it feels strange, being here. Starting over." Her eyes stayed fixed on the tea, not me. I waited, not wanting to break whatever fragile thing was happening. She exhaled slowly, as though pushing the words out. "When you spend years building a life, marriage, home, routines, and then suddenly it's gone, it's like walking into a room where all the furniture's been moved. You're the same, but nothing fits anymore." Her honesty struck me. I had expected her to stay on the surface, to keep that polished composure she always carried. But this was unguarded. Vulnerable. I set my mug down carefully, leaning just slightly closer. "That sounds lonely." Her lips curved into a faint, almost sad smile. "It can be. For a moment, silence settled over us. Not the easy kind we'd shared before, but a weightier one. The kind that carries unspoken truths. She rubbed her arm absently, like she was grounding herself, and before I could second guess it, I reached out, just lightly, resting my hand over hers. The shift was immediate. She stilled, her eyes lifting to mine, wide with something I couldn't quite name. Surprise. Maybe fear. Maybe relief. Her hand didn't pull away. In fact, after a few seconds, she turned it over, letting her palm rest against mine. Warm. Soft. A deliberate choice. "Thank you," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. I shook my head. "You don't need to thank me." But the truth was, I felt it too, the ache beneath her strength, the longing hidden under layers of composure. And the more she revealed it, the harder it became to keep my own feelings locked away. When she finally pulled back, it wasn't abrupt. Her hand lingered against mine, sliding away like she wasn't ready to lose the connection but knew she had to. The porch light from outside filtered faintly through the blinds, casting a soft, golden hue across her face. In that glow, she looked both untouchable and entirely human. I left her apartment that night with more than tea warming me. I carried the weight of her vulnerability, and the realization that I wanted to be the one she could trust with it. It happened on one of those evenings that felt too quiet, where the silence itself seemed to press against the walls. I had been heading upstairs when I saw her standing just outside her apartment door, a small bundle of mail in her hands. She was reading through it absent-mindedly, brow furrowed, lips pressed together in thought. When she noticed me, her expression softened immediately. "Evening," she said, voice warm but carrying a thread of something else. Tiredness, maybe. "Evening," I replied, slowing my steps. "Anything interesting in there?" She held up a flyer, smirking faintly. "Unless you're desperate for discount carpet cleaning, not really." I laughed, and for a moment it felt like we were two people who had known each other much longer than a handful of weeks. She leaned against the doorframe, and without really thinking, I stopped to stand beside her. Close enough to smell the faint trace of her perfume, subtle as always. We slipped into conversation. Light at first, jokes, observations about the building, little things that shouldn't have mattered but somehow felt important. But as often happened between us, the edges blurred. Jokes turned into half-truths into something closer to confession. She tilted her head, studying me with that sharp, thoughtful look of hers. "You're not like most of the guys I know your age. Is that good or bad?" I asked, keeping my tone even but feeling my pulse quicken. Her lips curved, though not into a full smile. "I'm not sure yet." There was something playful in her voice, but also hesitant. And then, almost as if she surprised herself, she added softly, "You make me nervous." The words hit me harder than I expected. My chest tightened, a rush of warmth spreading through me. She had said it so quietly, like a truth she hadn't meant to let slip. I swallowed, searching her face. She didn't look away. Her eyes were steady, even though her body betrayed her, fingers fidgeting with the edge of the flyer, her posture shifting as though she was fighting the urge to step back inside and close the door. I could have let the moment pass. I could have laughed it off, made it lighter. But something in me refused to. "Good," I said, my voice lower, steadier than I felt. "Now you know how I feel." For a heartbeat, the air between us shifted. Heavy. Charged. Neither of us moved, and yet everything seemed closer, her presence, her scent, the warmth radiating from her body just inches away from mine. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she held my gaze, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that made it impossible to breathe. There was no mistaking it anymore. Whatever had been quietly building between us had just been named, without either of us planning it. Finally, she exhaled, almost like she'd been holding her breath the whole time. "You shouldn't say things like that," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" I asked gently. Her gaze faltered then, dropping to the floor for just a moment before returning to mine. "Because—" she shook her head, letting the thought trail off. Because it's complicated. But even as she said it, she didn't move away. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was electric. I could hear the faint hum of the hallway lights, the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, the way her breath caught as though she was teetering on the edge of something she wasn't ready to admit. Eventually, she cleared her throat, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I should go inside. I nodded, though neither of us moved immediately. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, aware that one more step could change everything. When she finally turned and slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her, I stood there in the hallway, pulse racing, trying to process what had just happened. She had admitted it, just as I had. We were no longer pretending. The line had been crossed. After that night in the hallway, nothing between us felt the same. We didn't talk about what was said. We didn't need to. The words hung there, invisible but undeniable, like the faint scent of smoke after a fire. You could pretend it wasn't there, but it lingered. A few days later, I found myself on the back steps of the building just as the sun was going down. The air carried the crispness of early autumn, that faint bite that makes you want to pull your jacket tighter. She was already there, sitting on the wooden bench, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. I hesitated, then sat down beside her, leaving just enough space to be respectful. But not so much that I couldn't feel her nearness. She gave me a sideways glance, a half-smile. You always seem to know where to find me. Maybe I just get lucky, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The truth was, being this close to her set something in me humming. Her presence was subtle but overwhelming, like a quiet song you can't get out of your head. For a while, we just sat in silence, watching the horizon fade from gold to blue. Her shawl slipped slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and the gesture, so ordinary, caught me off guard. My gaze lingered longer than it should have, tracing the curve of her neck, the soft lines of her profile. She noticed. Of course she did. She always noticed. Her lips curved, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. She pulled the shawl tighter, but not before I caught the faintest shiver, not from the cold, I thought, but from something else. I shifted slightly, my shoulder brushing against hers. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but neither of us moved away. My pulse quickened. Our hands rested between us on the bench, so close that the space felt like a challenge. I could see the faint lines on her fingers, the delicate movement as she adjusted her mug of tea. And then, slowly, as though my body acted before my mind could stop it, I let my pinky extend, just enough to graze hers. The touch was feather-light, almost nothing. But the effect was immediate. Her hand stilled. Her breath caught, audible even in the quiet. I didn't move further. I didn't need to. That single point of contact carried more weight than anything we had spoken so far. She didn't pull away. Instead, after a few seconds, she shifted ever so slightly, letting her pinky brush back against mine. Deliberate. A signal. The silence around us thickened, not heavy but charged, filled with everything we weren't saying. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, to let the moment breathe instead of rushing it. Finally, she exhaled, her voice soft, almost a whisper. You don't know what you're doing to me. I turned to her, catching the faintest tremble in her smile. I think I do, I said quietly. Her eyes met mine then, steady, unflinching, but vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. It was as if all her walls, all her practiced composure, were starting to slip. We stayed like that, hands barely touching, shoulders pressed close, while the night settled around us. No kiss. No grand gesture. Just the quiet electricity of knowing we were both standing on the edge of something we could no longer deny. When she finally stood, pulling the shawl tighter, she looked down at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, half fear, half longing. Good night, she murmured, her voice unsteady. Good night, I echoed, though I knew there would be nothing restful about the night ahead. Because the taste of her presence, the warmth of her touch, lingered like a fire I couldn't put out. The days after that near touch were restless. I caught myself listening for her door, for the faint sound of her steps in the hallway. Every glance we shared seemed to carry an unspoken weight, as though we were both holding back something that refused to stay hidden. It finally came to a head one evening. The sky had been heavy with clouds all day, and by nightfall, a steady rain tapped against the windows of the building. I was heading up the stairs when I saw her standing by the entrance, umbrella in hand, watching the downpour as though lost in thought. She looked different. Not just because of the way the lamplight caught in her hair, but because there was a stillness about her, like she was bracing herself for something. When she noticed me, she didn't smile. Instead, she gestured lightly toward the rain. "Listen to that. It's almost too much." I stepped beside her, close enough to hear the soft cadence of her breathing. "It's peaceful," I said. "In its own way." She gave a small shake of her head. "Peaceful for some. For me, it feels loud." Her voice had an edge of vulnerability, and before I could think of how to respond, she sighed and turned to me. Her eyes glistened, not from the rain, but from something deeper. "This," she started, then stopped, searching for the words. "Whatever this is between us, it scares me." The words struck hard, but not in the way I feared. There was no rejection in them. Only fear. I kept my voice low, steady. "Why?" She hesitated, her hand tightening around the umbrella handle. "Because I've lived through too much to pretend things like this are simple. Because people will look at me and wonder what I'm doing, why I'd let someone your age get close. And because..." She swallowed, her voice breaking slightly. "Because I'm terrified I'll be too much for you, or not enough." The raw honesty in her confession held me still. For a moment, I could only watch her, seeing the weight she carried finally slip through the cracks of her composure. Without thinking, I reached out and took her free hand. She froze, staring down at the connection, then back at me. "You don't have to be anything other than who you are," I said quietly. "It's not about age. It's not about anyone else. It's about the way I feel when I'm with you." She blinked, tears threatening to spill. "And how is that?" I managed a small smile, though my heart was pounding. "Alive. Like I see the world differently when you're in it." Her breath hitched, a faint, trembling laugh escaping her lips. She pressed her forehead into my shoulder, as though the weight of holding herself upright had finally become too much. I wrapped my arm around her instinctively, pulling her close. Her body was warm against mine, her hair brushing my cheek. She clung to me in a way that told me she hadn't let herself lean on anyone in a long time. We stayed like that, the sound of the rain filling the silence, our breathing sinking slowly. My hand brushed along her sleeve, a small, steady rhythm meant to reassure, to anchor her. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were damp but brighter. "You don't know what you're promising," she whispered. "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I know what I feel. And I know I don't want to walk away from this." She held my gaze for a long moment, as though searching for cracks in my certainty. And when she didn't find them, she nodded, almost imperceptibly, like she was allowing herself, just this once, to believe. The world outside was still drenched, but inside, in that quiet corner by the door, something had shifted. The fear was still there. But so was hope. The night after her confession stayed with me like an echo. Every word, every tremble in her voice replayed itself in my head, and I knew nothing between us could go back to how it had been before. We had stepped out from behind the safety of polite smiles and neighborly chats. We had shown too much of ourselves to pretend anymore. A few days later, I found her outside again. It was late evening, the air cool and touched with the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. The neighborhood was quiet, as if holding its breath. She sat on the bench near the back steps, a shawl draped around her shoulders, staring out at the darkened sky. When she noticed me, there was no surprise in her expression. Almost as if she had been waiting. "You always find me," she said softly. "Or maybe you let me," I replied, easing down beside her. Her lips curved faintly at that, though her eyes held the same quiet storm I had seen the night of her confession. For a moment, we didn't speak. The silence stretched, filled with the rustle of leaves and the soft hum of the night. Finally, she turned toward me. Her gaze was steady, but her voice betrayed the conflict inside. I don't know where this leads. I don't know if I can give you what you think you want. I studied her face, the way the lamplight softened her features, highlighting both her strength and her vulnerability. I'm not asking for guarantees, I said gently. I'm just asking for this. For you. One step at a time. Her breath caught, a faint tremor passing through her shoulders. She looked away briefly, gathering herself, before her hand shifted across the bench. Slowly. Deliberately. Until her fingers brushed mine. The touch was so small, yet it felt like the most decisive thing she had done since we met. I closed my hand over hers, not gripping, just holding, letting her feel the steadiness I wanted her to know was there. The air between us thickened. She turned back to me, and in her eyes I saw not just hesitation, but a longing that had been carefully hidden until now. Do you have any idea how complicated this could get? She asked, her voice low. Yes, I said. And I don't care. Something in her expression softened then, like a knot finally loosening. She leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching mine. For a suspended moment, neither of us moved. Then, as if drawn by something neither could resist, she closed the gap. Her lips met mine in a kiss that was not hurried or uncertain, but tender. Careful. A kiss that carried every unsaid word, every quiet longing, every silent moment we had shared up until now. When she pulled back, her breath was unsteady. I haven't done this in a long time, she whispered. Me neither, I said with a smile, which made her laugh softly, the sound breaking through her tension like sunlight after rain. We stayed close, our hands still entwined, her head leaning against my shoulder. The world around us faded, the crickets in the grass, the glow of distant windows, even the worry that tomorrow might complicate things. None of it mattered in that moment. She shifted slightly, her voice almost lost in the night. So, what happens now? I squeezed her hand, keeping my eyes on the dark horizon ahead. No, I said. We walk there together. Wherever there is. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let out a long breath, the kind that releases more than air. It released fear, and doubt, and all the walls she had kept between us. When she finally spoke, it was soft, but sure. Together then. And just like that, the uncertainty was still there, but it no longer mattered. Because for the first time, we weren't standing on opposite sides of it. We were stepping into it side by side. The night settled around us, calm and unbroken. But inside I knew something had changed forever. 18L.